Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to another edition of English Wednesdays. I'd also like to thank Mandadori, who's helping us put this together. And I'd also like to introduce Richard Twigg. I think many of you know him. He'll be talking to us today about giving 360-degree feedback and what that really means for you as teachers. I will be monitoring questions as always, and about 5 minutes before the end, I'll jump in and I'll ask those questions to Richard. So because sometimes it's not possible for him to both speak and kind of monitor all the questions. I'll also mention a few other details about the attestato for you at the end of the presentation. And finally, I did want to just mention that Richard is going to be using some examples in his presentation from the new Macmillan Mondadori course book, Gateway to Success, Level B2. So without further ado, let me pass the mic over to Richard, and I'll talk to you all in about an hour. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Casimir. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks to Mondadori and Macmillan for the opportunity to share my knowledge with you, to go through what I see as 360-degree feedback. So as Casimir said, we're going to be looking at feedback, but we're going to try and look at it over the whole spectrum, the whole range. So let's get started and see what this is all about. So first of all, let's start out by looking at what feedback actually is. So I'll let you guys read this. So I think, as you can see there, it's very important that there's a couple of keywords there, that it is the information. We're getting feedback, we're getting information, which allows the learner to reduce this gap between what they know at the moment and what could or should be the case, because maybe it's a goal they have, or maybe at their level, they should be at a certain level and they've got some gaps. So that's very important, that it's looking at that information. And this has come from a book written by Hattie and Yates, Using Feedback to Promote Learning. Have a look at this diagram here. So we've got the learner in the middle, and obviously this is a continuous cycle. So if we start up at the top, we have the learner and they receive feedback from their teacher. Then the learner should, and we'll look at this, how they do it. They actively engage with the feedback that they have received. They then use that feedback to modify their knowledge. From the modification of this knowledge that they have enacted as a result of the feedback, they should, or they will then improve or work on improving their language production. They will then get further feedback from the teacher, and so the cycle goes on, and the theory being they will continue to improve, to increase their level based on the fact that obviously they need to take an active role, they need to engage, and they need to work on the feedback, and we need to look at how we give students appropriate feedback for them to be able to work on it and use this information. So another little quote for you guys to look at. Again, I'll let you read it rather than me reading it out to you. So I think, as I've highlighted the key things, feedback is not about trying to formally evaluate the students. This is not a kind of an ultimate test, a summative test. We use it to point the students in the right direction. We are helping, supporting the students to reach their goal. How do we do this? Through commenting, through scaffolding. If people have heard me speak before, you will have heard me talking about scaffolding. Scaffolding like in the construction industry, it's there for a purpose. It's there to support the construction of the building. We use scaffolding in the same way in language teaching. We put it there to support the learning. Some students might need scaffolding at different times and different tasks and different activities, but we provide them with the help and the support as they need. We can also remind them, we can offer models, we can offer examples. They're all different ways of us supporting the students. And that was a quote from 2018. So here's an example that I've taken from Unit 1. So for example, if we look at the speaking activity, it says to students, in pairs, read Emma's Instagram post and decide if the words in red are nouns or verbs. And what do you think they mean? So this is a kind of scaffolding where the students have been asked to look at, to find the words, and then to decide on their previous knowledge and information, are these nouns or verbs? And then they start to guess so that they are engaging in the topic. They've got information, and then the teacher can provide them with feedback and say, this is what you don't know, or this is what you know at the moment. Here is a gap. Let's fill that gap. Let me explain what these words mean. And once you've guessed, maybe you can judge from context, etc. Then make a valued judgment. So this is one way that we look at how we give them, bridging this gap, filling in the information. After that, the next task says to the students, use a dictionary to check any words that you are not sure about. So again, we're making the students autonomous, independent. They're working with the feedback that they've got, and they then improve. And with that, they then increase their language use, their vocabulary use, and in theory, they can then use that in their own writing or their own production, whether it be through speaking, writing, or when they come across it later in reading, they're familiar with the language. So I'm sure that because we're in Italy, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of caveat emptor, from Latin, let the buyer beware. I've changed that to let the teacher beware, because there are a couple of catches and we need to be aware of things as a teacher. So what do we need to be aware of? That learning from feedback cannot be forced. This is not something that we can force down the throat of the students. We can't make them learn from the feedback. What we have to do as teachers is to create the right conditions for learning to take place. And we know as teachers in general, we can't force our students to learn, and we can't force our students to learn from feedback. If we create the right conditions, if we make the students feel comfortable, then learning will take place both from the feedback and learning in general. So it's very important that we set out and the students know what the feedback is about, what they can do with it, and how they can work with the feedback. So there are three types of feedback questions that we can look at. First of all, we need to say, what is the goal? What is it that we want the students to achieve? Or the students might ask, what is their goal? What are they trying to achieve? And we know in ourselves that if we don't know where we want to go, or we don't know what our goal is, how can we assess how far away we are from reaching that goal? We might know where we are, but if we don't know where we want to go, we can't then judge how far or what we need to do to reach that goal. The next thing to do is to make a value judgment as to how far am I? How close am I? What progress have I made towards that goal? Am I making progress? Am I going backwards? Am I standing still? So what progress is being made? What progress has been made in that direction? And what is the next step? Where do we go from here? How can we now move forward, move on, etc.? So obviously, in any good course book, they will have things like a progress check. Now, a progress check is a good way of checking where are we? What do I know? What are my gaps? Where do I need to go? So in this particular situation, they're using the can do. So we're using the can do statements, as we know from the Common European Framework. But here they're saying, I can use make and do appropriately. So if the students look at those and they say, okay, I can't do one or two of those, have a look at the bottom. It says, if you need to improve, they can go off and they can find other activities. You as a teacher can use this as a starting point and say, okay, what are the things that you can't do? Right. So then the next lesson, we need to revise, go over, point them in the direction and find out where those gaps are and how you can fill those gaps so that they can make progress and they can move forward. So let's look at effective feedback itself. So effective feedback needs a number of factors. There needs to be a number of things present for feedback to be effective. First of all, it needs to be goal referenced. We need to have it linked, as we said before, we need to know where we are and we need to link it to a goal, to an outcome. Okay. And it's very important that the students understand that goal. So if it's a goal that they've set, hopefully they understand it. If it's a goal that we have set because maybe they're in a particular year group or they need to reach a particular level, whether it be for IELTS or whether it be for an end of year test or a mid-course test, or in order to understand that to move on to the next level or the next unit, the students need to understand what that goal is. They need to buy into the goal. It can't just be a goal that we as teachers set that the students don't understand. The next thing is that this feedback needs to be both tangible and transparent. So what do we mean by that? So tangible, it needs to be something that the students can get hold of. It's something realistic. It's not some pipe dream. It's not something that is out there that they can't get hold of, they can't understand, they can't get to grips with. And it needs to be very transparent. There's no hidden meaning. It's clear. This is what we need to do. So if you need to follow these 3-4 steps to move towards your end goal. Next thing is that feedback needs to be actionable. They need to be able to do something with it. Can the students act on it? If I've given them feedback, but they can't actually act on, they can't do anything with the feedback, either because it's not clear or it is not understandable to the students, unfortunately, that feedback is no use to them. So it needs to be something that they can work on and they can see how they can work on it and they can achieve whatever it is that they've been set to achieve within this goal of theirs. Next thing that we need to look at is it needs to be user-friendly. So what we mean by that is it needs to be either accessible to the entire class if we're giving complete class feedback, or it needs to be accessible to the particular student that it's aimed at. So if it's not accessible, if it's not user-friendly, if it's not understandable, again, the students can't act on it, and so the feedback is no longer effective. Timely. So this one probably speaks for itself. We need to deliver it as soon as possible. That doesn't mean that it needs to be delivered immediately. If we look at speaking feedback, it might well be that we use delayed feedback, as we call it, and we don't give them immediate feedback because we are practicing their fluency. And if we're practicing fluency, we don't want to keep interrupting the students every time they make a mistake, because they're just going to get very, very frustrated and they're not going to make progress. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to give them feedback 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month after the event, depending on what it is. It could well be that we're giving them feedback from a test or an assignment and we have a lot of work to do. We need to deliver that within a timely fashion, but the students need to be aware. So this, as soon as we can provide the feedback, or the sooner we can provide the feedback, the better, because then it's still fresh in their minds and they know what they were thinking at the time and how they can move forward and what they can do with that feedback that you've given them. The feedback also needs to be ongoing and consistent. This is not something that we can just do today, not do for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then suddenly do again, or do once a week. it needs to be something that is ongoing, and we need to have consistency. The students know, if I do that, that's the feedback I'm going to get. If I do that, that's the kind of feedback I'm going to get. It doesn't change. The students know, and they start to feel consistency coming through, and they can work on that, and they're not going to be met with surprises. And this obviously is one of the basic elements of formative assessment, that we have ongoing. Formative assessment must be ongoing, because the whole point of formative assessment is it informs us of where the students are and where they need to be. And also we're looking for consistency. In the same way, if you look in any sport or any exam, you want consistency. You want students to feel that things are consistent, that they're not changing or moving the goalposts, as we say in English. Last couple with feedback, it also needs to be focused. We need to focus in on a particular point or a particular area. And the focus needs to be on the behavior. What have they produced? Not on the character or the personality. You don't give feedback because you don't like that person, or you don't like the way that person responds or does something as part of their character trait. Give them concrete feedback, something that is not personal. It's not personal. It is on their language, it's on the pronunciation, it's on the use of a particular word or sentence structure. So it's the behavior of that student in the production of the language, not necessarily their character or personality, because then that is not focused. That is then not objective feedback. That's more it's a personal attack. Effective feedback also needs to be very proactive. So we need to, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's, we need to give feedback, but we think that, well, it's best avoided, or if I delay, maybe I won't have to do it, because maybe we know that the students will react badly or they won't be happy. But we need to know, and the students need to know, I'm giving you feedback, and I'm giving you feedback on your behavior. This is not a personal attack on you. And the feedback is there to help you and to support you. So it's important that the students are made aware of this, and that they get on board from the beginning, and they appreciate, and then the students will actually welcome the feedback. And they will look for that feedback because they know that it's there to help them, not to knock them down or to show them what they haven't done correctly. Descriptive. We need to focus on the progress, not on the result. And this is something we will look at. And all too often, I think students are more concerned with the result. How often do we get them to do a task or an assignment, and they just want to know what the result was? What did I get? What mark did I get? What percentage did I get? What grade did I get? But they don't look at it and say, okay, I got a higher mark, or I did better than I did last time. I'm making progress. And that's where we need to get them to see. And that is what effective feedback is all about. It's on the progress that they have made on this journey. Because they could be getting the same result, but they're not achieving that goal or getting to that objective. Then the real learning is not taking place. They're standing still, and we need them to move forward. So, final two. I forgot that it was a previous slide, so I apologize. It must be balanced. Okay. So very important that we don't only focus on the negative. It's very easy because as teachers, we look for mistakes, or we're drawn to mistakes because our eyes are drawn to it. But we also need to focus on the positive. And sometimes we talk about sandwiching feedback. So having a positive, so we get their feelings up, they feel confident, they feel good. Then we can look at the things that are not good or need to be worked on, and possibly we can then finish off with something positive. So the negative is in the middle, as we call it, in a sandwich, and they actually feel the two good parts, balance them, and they feel, okay, it's not perfect, but I've done a good job. I know where I need to go, and I know what I've done well. So I can work on the stuff I've done well in, and I can focus on the things that were not so good. Okay, so let's now flip the coin and see what effective feedback isn't. So I apologize if some of you will be a little bit shocked, but effective feedback isn't giving them a grade or a score. I know that's what the students are always after, but the grade or the score isn't giving them anything constructive, anything to work on. Okay. You know, if we look at that, a grade or a score is providing no information on how to improve. And unfortunately, we need to get the students to realize or to see the benefit in having proper feedback and not just looking at the grade or the score, but looking at the positives, looking at the things that they can improve, look where they have improved from the previous time, so they're starting to see progress. The feedback is also, unfortunately, not making value judgments like things that was a good answer or that was an interesting answer. Okay, because again, that's not telling the students why you're making the judgment. So based on what? Good compared to what? Compared to the other students, compared to what I said before. Interesting in what way? So, you know, we need to give them something more concrete. There was a great example of using the passive, or there was a good attempt at that structure. You made a couple of mistakes, but you're moving in the right direction. That's feedback rather than just saying good or interesting. We need to give them more information to work on. It's also not just purely advice and assessment. Because if we give them advice, well, you need to improve, you need to increase your vocabulary, or we just assess them and say, you got a 7 out of a 10 or what have you. We're not actually giving them any real direction. We're not helping them to get closer to their ultimate goal. Okay. And sometimes we sort of think that giving them advice is enough, but it's not specific enough. We've said before that the feedback needs to be specific. Here is the problem. Here is the issue. We've highlighted it. What do we need to do to fix that or to bridge the gap between where you are now and where you need to be or where you want to be, depending on where we're looking at the goals, who set them. So something here, for example, again, so this is an example that's looking at either in Valsi or first. So reading and use of English. So get the students to complete the task, and then they would look at the underlined words in the text. There's a text that goes alongside this because now they've read the text and they've answered the questions. So again, now they're looking to see what words do they know, what words do they not know. Guess, check in the dictionary. And then we know that when we get the students to personalize, to use what they've learned or taken in, and they can use it with things that are important to them. Which of these subjects would you like to study and why? So now they can get passionate. They can start talking with feeling. And then we've got an opportunity to then listen to their responses and to give them feedback on where they are, where they're going, what was good, what was not so good, where they could improve, etc. Okay. Then in a lot of course books nowadays, we're talking about critical thinking. We're talking about more cognitive engagement. Here we're getting students to compare ideas. And maybe they could start thinking about giving advice or looking at different things. So again, they're getting, the more the students can get cognitively engaged, the more involved they are, the more learning takes place. And the more learning that takes place, we start to bridge that gap to where the goal that they ultimately want to reach. Again, in here, we've got a quick test. I can't help but maybe someone in the administration, and so they can do a quick formative assessment, because these are formative assessments. It's going to inform the students where their gaps are. Maybe they don't know the answer to number 3 or to number 5, they can then go away, revise it, or the teacher can have a look and say, okay, everybody's got a problem with that. That's something we need to revisit or look at, or when does that come a problem and what has or hasn't been explained. So we're using that to inform the learning. So when we look at students' writing, there are a number of ways in which we can give them feedback. So let's have a look at these options. One possible way, and now I'm talking about not just giving them a grade at the top of the page. Okay, this is the kind of looking at different kinds of feedback that we could use what's known as a correction code. We could use criterion highlighting if we are marking for an exam, or it doesn't even have to be for an exam. We can use that criteria and we can use that as a basis for our marking. It doesn't only have to be linked to an exam. We could give them individual feedback, and that could be individual feedback in a class, or it could be individual feedback in a one-to-one session. We could use the comments function in Microsoft Word. We could also annotate or make notes on a PDF. And we could also use the peer feedback. Okay. Now, all of these can be used either online, or they can also be used in a face-to-face classroom. So they work in both areas, in both fields. Some of them you would then give the students feedback in this way, and then they would look at it and then they could discuss it later on. But let's have a look and see how these work. So the correction code, and this is probably something that I would say a fair few are probably familiar with or seen something similar. But by doing this, by using the upside down V, or by using the GR or the SP or the P, and normally we would mark that in the margin, either on the left or the right. What we are doing is we're saying to the students, have a look. There is a word missing here. What do you think that word could be? Rather than giving them the word, getting them to get cognitively involved, to think about what's missing. In the sentence, there is a grammar error. Reread the sentence, have a look at the sentence, see if you can spot that grammar error and correct it yourself. Spelling error, punctuation error, etc. Okay. And I would suggest, for ease of use, putting this into the margin. You might in the beginning want to underline where the error is, but I think to a certain extent we need to be careful of not spoon feeding the students by either giving them the correct answer or highlighting it. Get them to think about it and try and see if they can work it out for themselves. As we've seen before, getting them cognitively involved, getting their brains thinking, they starting to look at, they're trying to work out. If they work with it themselves, they're going to remember it. It's going to go into their long-term memory, and it's going to be more memorable. Rather than the teacher saying, here are all your mistakes, go with a red pen, mark all the mistakes. Unfortunately, we know a lot of the time the students don't do anything with that. We spend all that time correcting their work, and how many times do the students just look at the mark, look at the grade, and if there is no mark or grade, they ask what the grade or the mark would be, and they're not bothered about improving. Now, I'm very conscious that, as teachers, we have a lot of work already, but what we really need to do is, if we're giving students feedback on their writing and we take the time to do any one of these methods that we're going to talk about, if we just give it back to the student and leave it there, we've lost a massive opportunity. I think we need to say to students, here is your writing with feedback. Now what you need to do is take that writing, work on the feedback, and represent that to me as a teacher. Yes, I know in the beginning we are creating extra work, but if we do that, the student's writing will improve. And by the second or the third attempt, we are going to find that the first time we mark it, we're going to get a much better piece of writing. And we're in the process of trying to improve the students and push them towards their goal. If we just keep giving them back pieces of writing with corrections on and they don't do anything with it, sorry, ladies and gents, they're not going to improve because they're not getting involved. They're not reading the feedback. They're not taking it in. They're not working with what we've given them. They need to, as we've seen in the beginning, they need to be actively involved in the feedback. They need to work with it. They need to see the reason. They need to fill and work on filling that gap and trying to work out so they don't make the same mistake time and time again. So this is the criterion highlighting. Now, anybody that works with exams will recognize this as a kind of an exam criteria highlighting. But there's no reason why, if we think about this, any piece of writing, if we ask the students to do a piece of writing, we should be judging their writing on something similar to this. Their content, what they wrote about, did it deal with the topic in question? Was it relevant to what they were writing about? Did they have to write to a friend, and did they end up writing to a relative, or did they write to a boss? So is the content relevant to the question? The communicative achievement, they set out to complain, to inform, to request, to ask. Did they achieve that goal? Did their writing do that? So in their writing, in the task, so take something as simple as writing a complaint letter. Did they detail the complaint, and did they say what they want done as a result of the complaint? They were applying for a job. Did they successfully put their case across to apply for a job? So we can look at any piece of writing. Doesn't only have to be for an exam. Maybe they were writing a story. Was the content, did it answer, was it based on the question? Did they engage the reader? Was it interesting? Was it fun? Did it have a twist in the tail? The organization, we're looking at the structure. So does the writing have some kind of a structure? Did they use paragraphs? Do the paragraphs have one idea, or do they have 3 or 4 ideas, or is it just blocks of text that aren't actually paragraphs? Have they used linking words? Have they signposted? Have they helped the reader to follow? And what about their language? You could also, you could look at language range and accuracy. You could look at vocabulary. You could decide, but as long as you have a set of criteria which are made available to the students, and you say, I'm going to judge you, I'm going to provide you feedback on your writing based on these criteria or these areas. Okay. So just to give you an example, so have a quick look at this. So this was an example that the students were set as a task. Your grandmother's given you some money. There's enough to buy a really good camera or to go on holiday. Your parents want to save the money. What should I do? Okay, so this is part of a letter. So they look at the information and they now need to reply to the friend giving some advice. Okay, so what is the task? What do they need to do? They need to give advice. They need to reply to the letter. Okay, so that is their task. That is their goal. So if we think back to the content, the organization, the communication and the language, etc. So we're looking at the writing based on that. Now, I do apologize because I know that as teachers, when I show you the next piece, you are all going to be desperately wanting to get out red pens, or if we now kind of decided that red is out, you want to get another pen and you want to start correcting and looking at it. But let me show you this, and I would just, obviously you'll be writing comments in the chat, but have a look at this and it'd be interesting just to get your first impression. So traditionally as a teacher, we would be looking and we would start correcting, underlining, question marking, etc., and probably correcting and then giving it back to the student. But that's not feedback, because all we've looked at there is we've looked at all the stuff that is wrong. So what I suggest that we do is we take a back seat and we don't look at the writing and immediately pick up a pen and start correcting it. But let's have a look at the positives. So they were asked to write a letter. Well, it's got an introduction, it's got an ending, it's got an introductory sentence. It might not be, it's not correct. That good news, your grandmother is good. Okay, so they've started out. They were told to write and talk about whether to go on holiday or to buy a camera. So they've mentioned both of those. They sign off by have a nice time and tell me you'll decide what you do. So again, grammatically it's not correct, but looking at the structure. So now we can give them feedback and say, well, as a letter, you've got all the structure. You've got some good ideas. You've answered the topic. However, there are a few things that we need to look at, and there are some errors. Maybe you could look at it again and you could try and see if you can notice some mistakes. So I might put in the left here that, you know, SP next to hello, Chris, and maybe a spelling mistake here, and a grammar mistake for that's good news. So there's something missing. Try and see if the students can see. Let them work on it. And then if they don't get the answers, they can come back to you and say, I don't know. I don't understand what's missing. Then you can help them. And that's the scaffolding, but they've actually thought about it. They've got engaged with the text. Now, the next was just to literally sort of shock you. But if this was being marked by an examiner, they've said for content, they would give them a 4 out of a 5 because there's some irrelevances, but they have informed the target reader. They did what they were aiming to do. They wrote a letter. They needed to tell the person and reply and ask for the advice. They offered advice. Okay. They set out the letter in a strict format. The problem was in the organization, it is connected, but the sentences and the language. So I think that if we start to look at the writing, not as a global mark, but looking at criteria that you agree with your students, you decide what you're going to mark it on, and you point out to the students something like this, you could give them and say, okay, here is the mark if you wanted it, but here are some comments. Here are some good comments. Here are some things that you need to work on. Go away and try and now see if you can get 4s down the line or 3s down the line. What do you need to do? And give them tips and advice how to get there and how to reach that goal. Next thing we could look at is giving them individual feedback. So one way to do this is the students give you the text. Maybe we're teaching now online, so I can copy it straight into a Word document if they've sent it to me as an electronic version. I can then share the screen with my student if I'm teaching a one-to-one student, or I could use it as an example if I have a group of students. And then I could work through the text together with the student and get the student to identify, or I could point out and say, in sentence number 2, sentence number 3, there is a grammar mistake, there's a spelling mistake. Have a look. And most of the time, the students might say, okay, I think it might be this, but at least, again, we're getting them cognitively involved. Rather than just giving them the correction, sending it to them, they're not working on it. It does take longer, but the feedback is invaluable, and you will see progress, and you'll see the students moving forward. If you're doing it this way, you can use colors, brackets, strike through, different ways to say, that's wrong, try this, or here's an option. I like to highlight words in different colors. So if it's something good, I highlight it in green. If it's something that I think they need to remember, maybe I'll highlight it in yellow. If it's a mistake that they've made before, maybe I'll highlight it in red to sort of say, come on, you made this mistake last time. Keep working on it. We're getting there, but keep reinforcing it. So here's an example So here I've used some yellow. I've crossed out, they used the word attendable. So I, through discussion with them, asked them, and if they didn't come up with it, I typed it in and then highlighted it to help them to see where they could go. So again, it's not just me typing and giving them feedback whilst they're watching. I'm getting the students involved in the process and asking them and say, come on, we are able to have a big knowledge. Does big collocate with knowledge? What other words, what other adjectives could I use? And I get them to come out with them. And if they don't, then I help them and I say, okay, here's a couple of words, but at least they're starting to think about it and trying to think, what else have I heard with knowledge? So that would be an example here. The other way that I could do it is by using comments in Word. If you're not familiar if you go into, if you can see here in a Word document, you go to review, then I have new comment, delete, etc. And I can then highlight a word or an area, and it gives me the opportunity, and I can then type in a comment here. Now with this one, what I might be doing is pointing them in the direction. So I said, you undertake a task. Okay, so they said about undertaking university. So I've tried to help them say, you undertake a task. It's better to say you continue their studies at university. So I'm helping them, pointing them in the right direction. This could be done remotely, but I don't give them the answer. I help them and support them and give them as much information as possible. They can go away, think about it, work on it. And this might be distant. I might not do it in real time together with the student. This is then sent to the student as a separate document for them to look at. And I would then revise or go through it together with them in another lesson. The other one, that let's say, for example, the students have given you a document and you take a photo, or it's come in a PDF format, or you've scanned it, however you want to get it into your computer. You can then open up Adobe Acrobat, and there's a toolbar, which I'll show you what it looks like. This is the toolbar. Okay, so you've got comment, highlight, underline, strike through, and the pen function. And you can also use this with any images. So for example, the students, it could be an activity or a project that students have, or a photo of something that students have produced. You could also use it to annotate in the same way. Okay. Then students are a fantastic resource. Just the other day, I was giving a presentation, and they basically, researchers said that we remember 5% or retain 5% of information that we literally hear in a lecture. We're not involved in any way. And as we get more involved, more engaged, so the retention goes up. And the highest retention rate of 90% is when we teach others. So if I have feedback and I need to give feedback to a fellow student, and I need to teach them and explain to them what my impression was, then my knowledge increases. So, but peer feedback has a bit of a caveat as well, because when we ask for peer feedback, the givers of the feedback need to listen or to read the language of their peers, and they need to listen or read carefully. Now, they are not going to give grammatical feedback because they don't have the knowledge that you have as a teacher, but they could look and sort of say, well, for me, that sentence doesn't make sense, or it could be more interesting or more exciting, or when I read it, I didn't quite understand. So they're giving that kind of feedback, not grammatical feedback. If they know another word, they might suggest a word, or they might help the students. One of the main advantages with this is we start to move away from teacher-centered classes, where the teacher is always the one giving the feedback, working through with the students, giving them information. And a lot of learners are very receptive. We know that students like or enjoy learning from their peers. And sometimes peers have a way of explaining things sometimes that it gels, or maybe they've understood it themselves, or they've worked out, or they can give them a better understanding. Sometimes they prefer to get that feedback. Sometimes they need it from the teacher, but sometimes peer to peer, they sort of speak the same language in a different kind of way. If we do it this way, it can also reduce the teacher's workload. So students can help each other, they can read each other's comments, and then they can work on it before they then give it into the teacher to mark. So it's already gone through a process where students have looked at each other's work and provided comments or feedback. The students can then correct it. So ultimately, by the time it comes to you, it's been kind of processed at least once, or they've reworded it, or they've worked on it. So hopefully there's less basic mistakes, and the teacher's workload is this lessened, because I'm not looking at all or getting bogged down by all of these basic mistakes that the students don't necessarily see the first time, but a second person reading it and pointing them out will be helpful or useful for the learner. Very important when we give feedback, peer feedback, that the focus is on general feedback, not on grammatical errors. So did you engage the reader? Did you answer the question? Did you use a range of vocabulary, or did you use the same words 10 times? Those are the kind of things that students can notice, not grammatical errors. They're not teachers. Very important that if we do peer feedback, the students get an opportunity to both receive and to give feedback. So get the students to exchange their writing, get students in groups to do a speaking activity, and one student listens to both and gives feedback, and then they change the roles. So it's not always, so everybody gets an opportunity. And we must also give the students some kind of a checklist, what to look out for. So look out for good vocabulary, repetition. Did they answer the question? Did they use paragraphs? Those kind of things. It just help the students to know what to look for and what they can give comments or feedback on. And obviously, the higher the level, the more they can give purposeful feedback. But if they practice at a lower level, they become more confident and more fluent with it later on. It's also very important that we explain why. Why are we doing this feedback? How does it help? It helps you to look at someone else's work. Someone else looks at your work. They're working on the same level. So we get the interest of the students that way. Combined feedback. Now, this is something we can really only do online. And this is for people that are not technologically shy, or shy away from technology. Screencast-O-Matic is free of charge. Snagit, you have to pay a registration fee for, but there is a free trial. And basically, you could record your screen like I'm doing a presentation now. It's a similar kind of process. I could record and I could talk about and say, okay, in the first sentence, there's a grammar mistake. Have a look and see, think about this, think about that. The students could then take that recording. I'm not physically in front of the students. I send it to the students, and the students could then have a look at my feedback, my video recording of my voice with the work together. And then I could give them feedback and sort of say, okay, here you go. Try it out yourselves. And I can do it for both spoken and written feedback. So they could send a video and I could give them feedback on their spoken word, but also I could give them spoken feedback, but I could also type feedback whilst I am recording. So I could have both. So they get two different things at the same time. Let's look finally at speaking feedback. So when we mentioned before, do we give them hot feedback, instant feedback? And obviously we do that when we are working on their accuracy, but not their fluency. Okay. If we give them delayed feedback, here the focus is on the fluency. So we wait until the end of the lesson or at the end of that activity. We make notes. And again, very important, tell them what was good. Don't only look at the negative. So in the instant feedback, you want to focus on the negative. That was a great piece of vocabulary, or that was a great expression, but then, we need to work on the accuracy, and we've worked on that expression before. You used it perfectly. Well done. But again, the problem is that it's purely accuracy. If it's hot feedback, delayed feedback, we want them to speak and get used to it, and then we give it to them in context, the feedback. Speaking strategies, we need to teach them some speaking strategies. How are you going to self-correct? How are you going to buy time? Well, that's a good question. Or I've never thought about that before. Or I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? So those kind of things that we can help them when they are speaking, that they do naturally in their own language. So get them to use that kind of language themselves. If we are doing speaking online, we can use the chat function. We can give them support. We can record the corrections in the chat function. If we're doing a Zoom lesson, a Teams lesson, or a GoTo meeting, or a Google Meet, depending on those, so we can use the technology that's available to us. Now, we could also record the session, and we could send that session to the students afterwards, and the students could re-listen or listen to themselves and work through their own feedback that way and see what they sounded like, how they could improve. We could also just use the old traditional pen and paper. I use it a lot of the time when students are speaking, when I'm doing lessons online. Even online, I write down the feedback, examples of good expressions, not so good expressions. And then when that activity is finished, I can then give them verbal feedback, or again, I can type that feedback into the chat. So I can be concentrating and I'm not typing on the screen and distracting the students. Some people just find pen and paper is easier to write the comments or the feedback and then to give it to them verbally afterwards. As I said before, it's very important not to just only focus on grammar errors, or any errors for that matter, not only grammar errors. It could be vocabulary errors, it could be other errors. We must look at a balance, look at good expressions, look at where they tried to use a grammar point but got muddled up. If they're trying to push things out of their comfort zone, give them feedback. Don't just sort of say, oh, you should have said it that way. Help them to say, well, that was great. You tried to use the third conditional, but you didn't quite get there, but you're going in the right direction. So be positive, be supportive in the feedback. Other things, as I said, is also to look at pronunciation and also vocabulary errors, but equally look at things that went well. You pronounced that word really well. We mentioned it last lesson. This time, you pronounced it perfectly. Well done. You've made progress. Keep supporting them. Keep moving them forward. Okay. So here are some examples where the students can complete the questions, and then they have a speaking challenge. So they can interview their partners. They put this into practice. They can then practice, and you can then listen, and the students can be practicing going backwards and forwards, speaking to each other. If you've got more students in the class, you can have a third person sitting in, making notes or writing down examples of good language, or any mistakes, if they spotted mistakes or a word missing or whatever. Sometimes the students will pick up some of the basic errors. So use them from that point of view. You could use the chat to provide support and a record of the correction. So you missed this example, or when you were reading that, the answer was X, Y, or Z. Again, you could record the session if you're teaching online, and you could share the recording with the students so that they've got your voice, your comments, your feedback to go over and to rewatch at a later stage. We could use pen and paper, like we said before. And key thing is, try and find out what caused the error. Was it because there was a piece of vocabulary that they didn't understand? Or did they misread the question? Or did they get stuck on a particular expression and they misread, or they misunderstood, or they used their L1 and they assumed what it meant and they didn't actually check? So that's very important to check that out. Okay, so close this down. Okay. So here's an example here. So read and listen to the article and check your answers. So they're getting practice in reading and seeing if they've then assessed their reading accordingly, and they can look and see where they've made the mistakes, why they've made the mistakes, or where the confusion is coming, and we can give them appropriate feedback. Listening feedback. I'm very getting close to time to wrap it up. So again, we can use the chat to provide support and a record of corrections. Again, we can record the session. Again, we can use pen and paper. So you notice there's a lot of continuation, and we can get a lot of consistency going. Give them the same kind of feedback, the same way, so the students are familiar and they're comfortable with the same feedback, so they know what to expect, when to expect it. Okay. Same thing. Here we're looking at things like connected speech. A lot of the time the students know the words when they are in normal written down words, but when they're connected, the words run together and the students get confused or they don't understand. And that's where the confusion, we can work on that, break it down and help them to understand. Ladies and gents, I would just like to thank you very much for taking up your precious Wednesday to listen to me. I believe Casimir has been taking a note of any questions that you might have. So I look forward to answering some of those questions now.
Yeah, so there was some good comments here. And a lot of people made the point, and I remember this myself, having been a teacher for so long, like how do you, it's very hard to get students to care about the feedback, like a number of teachers were saying they only care about the grade. You said the same thing yourself. Some of the tips you get, timely feedback, concrete feedback should engage, especially the better students. But what about like the middle group of students? I mean, any extra tips there on how to get?
I think the key thing is, like anything, is to kind of sit down and have a bit of a heart-to-heart with the students and say, whether you guys like it or not, you are here if you're in school because it's in mainstream and you need to get a certain grade. You want to get a certain grade because you want to go to university, you want to perform, and the only way to do that is to work on your learning and to start taking ownership, because in life, that's what you're going to have to do. So I think it's like anything. If we get the students on board and get them to realize the benefit, and they can see the benefit of getting feedback rather than just a grade, then they'll be more welcome and they'll be more willing to accept that feedback. But I think also it's just what they've become used to. And what are they doing? They're judging themselves against their peers instead of, in theory, judging themselves against themselves and saying, how have I progressed? Have I moved on from the last test? I got 25. This time I got 27. Fantastic. Maybe it's only 27 out of 50, but I'm making progress. I might be at the bottom of the class, but I'm judging myself against myself and not my friends that all got 40 or 50. And I start to push myself down because we are all different.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah, I mean, student motivation, especially for teachers of teenagers, is always an issue.
It's
though
very
for adults as well.
Yeah, I think it's just a case of it's trying to get them to buy into the lesson and to see the benefit. What's in it for me?
Right.
You've got to be here, so let's make it as fun as and enjoyable as possible. So it's not a chore. It's not something that you dislike doing. If you can get enjoyment out of it, then the time is going to pass and you're going to feel more comfortable and you're not going to hate it. And in that way, you'll be more receptive, and hopefully then you'll see the benefit as you improve. And unfortunately, this day and age, we know that English opens quite a few doors work-wise, etc.
Right,
so I think it's possibly a way of just sort of kind of engaging and motivating them that way.
All right, wonderful. So we are about out of time. I just want to remind everyone of a few things. First, an email should be sent around, which will just essentially confirm your presence this afternoon. And then from tomorrow, the attestato can be downloaded on mondadorieeducation.it/attestati. Final thing, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be having another meetup on Wednesday, as always, on the 10th of March. So just keep your eyes open for that. And Richard, thank you, as always.
Pleasure.
Always
Thanks
a
very
pleasure.
much. Thank you.
Thanks to all the teachers who participated. Thanks to Mondadori for helping make this possible. And I hope to catch everyone in about 3 weeks.
Great stuff, guys. And if I just leave you with one thought, if I've done nothing else, but I've sparked a thought or an interest, I've cognitively engaged you, just think about different ways. There could be, you know, okay, a lot of these things are unachievable, but if I can look at trying to give a little bit of feedback, maybe I can motivate the students, and that might help me in my learning process or in their learning process, in my way of helping them and teaching them. So not everything is possible. Rome wasn't built in a day. Take it step by step, and if nothing else, I've planted some seeds for you to think about and see how that goes. So thanks once again.
Cool. Wonderful, Richard. I appreciate it. Bye, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Take care, everybody. Thanks a lot. Cheers now.
Bye.
Cheers.